You're listening to episode 249 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Dr. Paul Fuller joins us to speak about Ditthi, or views, in Buddhism. Hi everyone. Before we get started with today's episode, I want to remind the listeners that we've started a new podcast which may also interest you. It's called Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science, and appears every other week, alternating with The Secular Buddhist. You'll find many of the same guests you've enjoyed and learned from here, as well as new researchers, teachers, and practitioners. You'll find Present Moment in the Science and Medicine section of iTunes, in Natural Sciences, or just do an iTunes store search for mindfulness and look in the results in the podcast section. You can also visit the website presentmomentmindfulness.com. Thanks for checking it out, and if you like what you hear, please feel free to share it with others. Have you ever heard someone offer their opinion and their passionate sharing seem to indicate more attachment than understanding? Or perhaps the view was very valid in one context, but might not have been so good a fit in another. Or perhaps you've been that person with the rock-solid view. Certainly I've made that mistake and continue to do so. It's part of the complexity of being human. So what does Theravada tradition have to tell us about views, in particular how we might distinguish between right and wrong views? Paul Fuller has a PhD in Buddhist Studies from the University of Bristol. He has taught religious studies at universities in Southeast Asia, the University of Sydney in Australia, and at Bath Spa University in the UK, and is currently lecturing in Buddhist Studies at the University of Cardiff. His research interests include early Indian Buddhist philosophy, the Buddhist ideas of Aung San Suu Kyi, and the prevalence of blasphemy in Buddhist culture. So sit back, relax, and have a nice grape seed tea. Our guest today is Paul Fuller. Paul, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, nice to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Very glad to have you with us. And I'm very eager to have this conversation because we don't often on the podcast get a chance to really dive deep into some of the terms and concepts that we have in the Pali Canon like we're going to today. So I appreciate that. Thank you very much. But let's start with your background. What first interested you about Buddhism?
Yeah, there's a bit of a story to be told there. And I don't usually tell this story. It's actually through the singer David Bowie. Many years ago, because he had a background in Tibetan Buddhism. And since his sad passing, that's been kind of widely reported. I used to follow anything that Bowie did as a teenager. And one of the things he did was an interest in Buddhism. And so that's what kind of piqued my interest in Buddhism. The influence from Bowie didn't last long, but obviously I took it where I wanted to take it myself. So that's the honest answer, and I don't usually get that very honest answer, to be honest with you.
I think that's a terrific answer.
Fair enough, yeah.
So what progressed from there? So you had an interest in this from when you were young, and then did you find a Buddhist center to start practicing, or what
I
happened?
did. Yeah, just to continue the last Bowie reference, I went to Samye Ling in the Scottish borders in Dumfriesshire as a kind of teenager, and was practicing Buddhism at various centres around England as well, some Theravada centres for a number of years. But then my interest did become completely academic, and I mean that in a very positive way, in exploring ideas, and often in a critical fashion. Then I went off to Edinburgh University. I kind of left school without any qualifications, and so kind of educated myself in religious studies and went off to Edinburgh, then to the University of Bristol, and kind of find myself with a PhD after a number of years. So it took on a completely academic interest for myself. But I'm using the term academic in a very positive way in which we can be critical of Buddhist ideas if we choose to be.
So let's get into our topic for today, Ditthi, or views. The listeners may be familiar with Samaditthi, or right view, as part of the Eightfold Path. I'm wondering, Paul, if you could give a brief overview of how you mean Ditthi in the context of the conversation today.
Okay, so yeah, many listeners will know that Samaditthi is the first stage of the Noble Eightfold Path. So in practicing Buddhism, one would want to cultivate the stages of the path, and primarily to cultivate Samaditthi, right view. And so right view has a very prominent position on the Buddhist path. So in simple terms, that's what we mean by right view, a right form of belief and an acquaintance with Buddhist ideas and doctrines. So in its simplest sense, that's what we're talking about when we talk about right view. You cultivate right views, Samaditthi, and you try to abandon wrong views, Micchaditthi. So that would be the simple answer to the question.
And for your book, The Notion of Ditthi, tell us about that. What's the premise? Because you dive deep a little bit more than that understanding you just shared.
Of course, yeah. So to give that first understanding, but there's a dilemma in the notion of Ditthi, and this is throughout Buddhist history. And the dilemma is roughly in these terms. You can consider Ditthi and right views and wrong views in terms of what I call an opposition understanding. Right view stands in opposition to wrong views. One cultivates right views, one abandons wrong views, as I said earlier. But the dilemma which comes out of this is that throughout Buddhist history, there's been a tendency to see a danger in views in general, because they can clearly become an object of attachment. So there's also what has been termed a no views understanding of views, in which any view, even a right view, if it becomes an object of attachment, is wrong. It's destructive on the Buddhist path. So in my book, which follows on from my PhD thesis, I explore this dilemma to do with views.
And there's an interesting part of that, which is the idea of discriminating thought, that there's a right and a wrong. And in your book, do you explore at all the issue of, okay, so how do you determine right from wrong? And things like the Kalama Sutta, it's not reason. It's really based on what the wise ones prefer, but how do you know who's wise?
Yeah, that's a very good way of asking the question. So in my understanding, and the way I kind of work my way through this dilemma, is that views are not wrong necessarily because they are cognitively wrong, because they are factually wrong, and views are not right because of their content, because they are truths, if you like. It's the fact that the determining factor which makes them wrong or right is all to do with attachment and craving. So if a view becomes an object of attachment, as I've already said, it's a wrong view. But this is not to do with its factual content. I don't consider suttas like the Kalama Sutta to be to do with Buddhism as a rational religion. There's a lot more going on here. Yes, just to follow on one more point, I think it's to do with the effect that the view has on the person holding the view. That's the fundamental kind of premise, the way I work my way through the dilemma of views.
So as we look at views, then we run into another aspect of this dilemma, maybe another dimension of it, in that there may be a tendency for us to look at a view or take a view and solidify it, make it a thing that applies in all circumstances. And there's no contextualization around it, that there's not the understanding of what is doing the greatest harm or the greatest benefit to self or others in this situation. And so there's more nuance involved in a view. So let's explore that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So that's a really good question to ask. There's a tendency when we look at Buddhism, it's a tendency which is kind of justified in many respects, that Buddhism becomes pragmatic in nature. We understand Buddhism as being all to do with what serves the purpose of overcoming suffering is correct. So there's a tendency to view Buddhism as a pragmatic in nature. And we sometimes think that Buddhism kind of shies away from truth claims. I think we have to be really, really careful here, in fact, because I'm not sure that Buddhism is entirely pragmatic in nature. But it also clearly has some sort of problem with universal truth claims. Now, I think it's best not to jump on either side of these arguments.
Right, again, it's not that simple, even with exploring the question.
No, it's not very simple at all. But I think there's real issues at stake here. I think Buddhism does want to describe the true nature of reality. Yatsa Buddhadasana, it wants to see things as they are. This is true of all Indian religions, and Buddhism is no exception to this. And so there's often a tendency, particularly in maybe modern practitioners of Buddhism, where they're kind of afraid of truth claims and religions that propose a truth. So they see Buddhism as some sort of ally in their religious enterprise or whatever, and they see Buddhism as pragmatic. Now, but I think it straddles between the two of these. One of the ways of looking on this is that what does Buddhism say is the ultimate cause of suffering? Now, in the Four Noble Truths, clearly craving is the cause of suffering, tanha. And I'm not the first one to point this out. It's a well-known issue within Buddhism. In the description of dependent origination, Paticca Samuppada, it seems that ignorance is the cause of suffering. Now, is Buddhism just clumsily describing the path to nirvana in its descriptions here, or does it have something very real to say about how we encounter the truth? I want to pause there because I'm answering the question kind of at length. See how you'd respond to that.
I think that's a great question. It all depends in part on which version of, for example, dependent origination are we looking at? Are we looking at a 12-step or a 9-step or a 5-step? How far back are we going? And really, are we going to go to the person got hit by a car because they were jaywalking, or because the car wasn't paying attention, or because of the Big Bang? How far back are we going to go?
Sure. Yep. Kind of in this description of reality, I think Buddhism is saying something definite about the way we encounter reality. So that both craving and ignorance are kind of twin dilemmas. Discussing this lecture I gave last week, and the audience there, kind of the conversation went along the lines that in kind of pre-modern times, pre-modern philosophy, these twin kind of hindrances of is and ought as kind of expressions of truth we're not separated. Where there's a fact, there's also value at stake. And Buddhism seems to be saying something very similar in its description of the dilemma to be overcome. Craving and ignorance go together, and at the same time, non-attachment and wisdom also part of the same process. There seems to be an allied kind of way that we have to understand the true nature of reality. That's why I would shy away from describing Buddhism as purely pragmatic in nature. It doesn't seem to appreciate that other part of the Buddhist path, where there is a very real description of reality. It just happens that if we become attached to that description, then the whole thing falls apart.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, and we see this in views, interestingly enough, that are shared in discussions online where people will boldly state Buddhism is a philosophy, and someone in the very next comment will boldly state Buddhism is religion, and they will both be correct because you can find all of that within the context of the tradition, and that it is also the other thing that's not yours, the part that really speaks to you. It's not a bad thing. It means that we're complicated beings who touch the Dhamma in different ways, and it touches us in different ways. That's okay.
Yeah. But I think many of these kind of online voices don't often appreciate this, do they? Because they take Buddhism in a certain way, don't they? They kind of caricature it into their own, what they want it to be. And again, I'm not the first person to point this out, where the Buddha in the past has been seen as taken on the mantle of various kind of philosophical or psychological traditions, where it's not seen in the round. That's why I was saying earlier on, an academic understanding of Buddhism actually has a lot of value, because we're not necessarily got a vested interest in its application, if you like. I know that has problems as well. That has its own problems coming with it.
Yeah, it's interesting to explore this idea that one may bring views that we don't see in the same way that the young fish are not aware of the ocean. When the big fish says it's all around you, we bring these biases to our conversations. I see this a great deal now in just today, commenting on an article on Tricycle that was very critical of a mindfulness center in part of the country that was not a Buddhist center. And all of the views that were being brought to this was, well, they're not doing things the way we do at our Buddhist center. And I had to point out, this is not a Buddhist center. Why would they?
Yeah, of course. I kind of to follow on from this, I think one of the things that's not often appreciated about the cultivation of right view is that, as is always the case in Buddhism, it comes back to ethical actions. And that's where the context, in the Pali Canon, that's the context of how right views are actually cultivated. So, like I'm saying, again and again, Buddhism always comes back to this idea that if you don't act in an ethical way, you're going to have no wisdom, you're going to have no insight into the true nature of reality. When I was conducting my research into the notion of Ditthi, this is precisely what I found repeatedly, that when the character in the Pali Canon, the Buddha as he appears in the Pali Canon, speaks about views, he also says that you have to act in an ethical way. When you undertake certain wholesome actions, that will change your attitude and you will have right views. So that's how he preaches the acquisition of right views themselves. It's part of an ethical path. I think that's really important. I think it's very often lost in conversations about Buddhism, where it becomes a matter of one's own opinion about what Buddhism is.
Yeah, and the conversation may also turn towards a question and exploration of, well, which Buddhist ethics? How do you mean ethics? Because what comes up for a Theravada person is not going to match what a Zen person or a Tibetan person would say.
In a way, but if I may, I slightly, I think there is some kind of fundamental frame. I know exactly what you're saying, but there is some sort of fundamental framework. The one in which I think the fundamental framework to kind of foundational Buddhism, if you like, away from different areas of Buddhism or sectarian differences, if you like. And I think this is just in what are called the Dasakas of the Karmapata. These are the 10 wholesome courses of action. And if you look at the 10 wholesome courses of action, they contain kind of abbreviated versions of the Panchasila of the 5 precepts and a couple of other factors. But the final outcome of the 10 wholesome courses of action is that you achieve right view. And as my understanding, this kind of ethical foundation would be part of all kind of schools of Buddhism, both historically and geographically. So I don't disagree with what you're saying, where some schools may emphasize a certain type of compassionate attitude for all sentient beings or whatever. I think it rests upon some basic premises.
I completely agree with you, and the pushback that we sometimes see in the discussions, and I certainly push back in this way, is if we're meeting those kind of baseline criteria, then what's the problem? And there typically isn't, because what you're discussing is included in, for example, mindfulness programs, and it may look different than we have in a traditional Buddhist center, but it's there. And so there isn't typically a valid response or any response to that, because it is there.
Yeah. It's really interesting the way this conversation's going, because I've had so many conversations over the years, obviously having conducted the PhD research and published the book on this, on the notion of Ditthi. But it's interesting talking to different people what they can take from this subject, because some students or some scholars can get very philosophical about this. Clearly, people like Nagarjuna and the Madhyamaka school was about views and opinions. You know, Nagarjuna had a very real focus upon views and opinions because there was a philosophical dilemma at stake. Whereas someone like Thich Nhat Hanh also has a great focus upon views and opinions, but maybe in a more practical setting. So I think what we're talking about now is perhaps part of the latter, where it's to do with ethical conduct. I think that's really valuable. This is often lost in our discussion of views and opinions in the notion of Ditthi, when we concentrate on the philosophical implications of holding to wrong and right views.
So, Paul, what do you find most interesting or perhaps even perplexing about Ditthi?
Yeah, again, a very good question. Yeah, there's something which has followed me through all these years from my undergraduate studies, where I was doing essays on the topic, right up until kind of, like I say, recent weeks, where I'm still giving papers on this subject. And I think there's something of real value that Buddhism has to say here about certain views and opinions causing conflicts. Something very simple, fundamental, but really, really important, that Buddhism can actually bring to the table in modern debates, philosophical debates, and political and social debates. And this is simply the basic idea of not being attached to one's own truth claims. In the Pali Canon, when the Buddha talks about how you should not hold your own opinions, he says you should not hold any opinion in the following fashion: this alone is truth, anything else is falsehood. That is precisely how one should not hold views and opinions. So I think this is the fascinating aspect of views and opinions. And I'll just give one more very brief example in the Brahmajala Sutta. The Buddha, basically, if you read the sutta, the Brahmajala Sutta, it's saying why should a Buddhist consider Buddhism to be a superior religion? And the answer given in my interpretation of the sutta is that Buddhism cannot lead to any attachment, even to the claims about the nature of reality that it has. It leads away from all forms of attachment, whereas any other view or truth claim leads to attachment. So this is why you should praise a Buddha in the context of that particular sutta, because his truth claim cannot be an object of attachment. If it is an object of attachment, then it's destroyed. Buddhism is destroyed precisely because it's an object of attachment. So that's why I find these dilemmas, these apparent paradoxes that turn out they're not paradoxes, they're quite practical instructions in nature. So that's what I find fascinating.
So let's segue a little bit. You're also researching something you refer to as ethnocentric Buddhism. I'm wondering if you could just spend a few minutes and tell us about that.
Okay, so this was to do with events primarily in Southeast Asia and specifically in Burma or Myanmar. And as is quite well known, and I'm publishing a couple of papers coming out later in the year on this topic, there's a group of extremist monks in in Myanmar, known variously under the headings or titles as the 969 movement or the Mavatar movement. And these are kind of nationalist movements which ally Buddhist identity with national identity. And I wanted to kind of understand this. And it relates to ideas to do with discrimination, which kind of feeds back into my research upon Ditthi. So I wanted to try to explain this phenomenon within Buddhism, partly in Buddhist terms. Can there actually be a nationalistic Buddhist movement? And if there is, on what premises can we understand this? So I've come up with this term, ethnocentric Buddhism, which, as many of these terms, it is sometimes problematic, and it can certainly be criticised, the use of the term, because on the one hand, these fundamentalist Buddhists, again for want of a better term, are kind of hold views and opinions which are extremely repugnant. But I wanted to explore whether throughout Buddhist history, Buddhism could have been part of nationalistic or ethnic identity, could be closely assimilated with Buddhism. And I think using the term like ethnocentric Buddhism, we can see a strand of Buddhism which clearly exists in modern South and Southeast Asia, but which could also have existed in the past. And it's not a view of Buddhism which we usually want to consider. It's kind of built into the idea is that one's ethnic identity is allied to one's national or local identity. So to be a good Burmese person is also to be a good Buddhist. And so this is kind of the idea at the outset of this concept.
Yeah, and it's interesting to hear about that area of study because we have seen similar events in Japan, World War II, and not to say that is the same. There are significant differences there, but it's very interesting to see this group that you're speaking of, which seems to be espousing views that are contradictory to what we usually hold as Buddhist ideals.
Yeah, but I think there's another, I think to understand this, of course, that on the one hand, this can't be Buddhist at all. No Buddhist could hold Islamophobic, racist views and opinions, like some of these groups clearly do hold views and opinions heading in that direction. So let's kind of state what these movements do. But on the other hand, away from these ideas about Buddhism, there is certain factors in Buddhism, what I've called in the Buddhist DNA, which could give rise to these movements. The idea that the Dharma will last a finite amount of time, yeah? So we have that idea from the early point in Buddhist history, where the Buddha states this several times, or it's stated in the Pali Canon, this idea. So if the Dharma is under threat in some way from a perceived enemy, even if the enemy is completely imagined by the Buddhist group doing this, then Buddhism should be protected. There can be a just Buddhist war, if you like, or there can be an idea of protecting the Dharma. So this can give rise to the ethnocentric type Buddhist movements where one has to defend the Dharma. If the Dharma goes out of existence, then no one has a chance of salvation at all. So I think these Buddhist groups, even though we may disagree with them fundamentally and not regard them as Buddhist, from their perspective, I want to try to understand how they can still understand this in a Buddhist context. And so I think there's certain themes in Buddhism which do lend itself to ideas of Buddhist identity and Buddhist ethnic identity. And I think this is often kind of not clearly kind of accepted by commentators about Buddhism, where Buddhism is the peaceful, compassionate religion, which it undoubtedly is in many contexts, but it's also very complex, and we shouldn't kind of belittle maybe adherents of Buddhism in Asia who actually use Buddhism as quite fundamentally as part of their national and ethnic identity. I'm not trying to justify it in any way. Anyway, to try to understand it, I've got into some trouble where people think, oh no, you're not calling these type of fundamentalist Buddhists what they should be called. which is kind of Islamophobic, racist in some contexts. I'm not denying that at all. It's trying to understand it in its complexity.
Right. And then there's a need to understand it because it is a part of Buddhism, whether we like it or not, whether we agree with it or not. It is there. And so understanding what some of the conditions may have been to cause this arising, it's very important for us to understand that.
Of course it is. So we shouldn't just kind of deny its existence. And we shouldn't also, I don't think we should just say it's a modern phenomenon. Because I have a strong feeling, the way that Buddhist history, or the nature of Buddhist history and the way Buddhism spread around Asia in general, it was always spread, or often spread, as part of empires and allied to ideas of kingship and emperors. And this is how Buddhism spread around Asia. It's not in the same way that Buddhism spread into kind of modern Western countries. It spread because kings and emperors adopted Buddhism because they see it as maybe as a pacifying force of unifying their kingdoms and their empires. And so you would expect, given those conditions, that Buddhism maybe has always had this element to it, where it becomes part of national, local, ethnic identity. Yeah, so I'm not sure we should be so surprised by this, to be honest with you.
Well, our guest today, Dr. Paul Fuller. You can find out more about his work on his website, drpaulfuller.wordpress.com. Paul, thank you so much for being here.
No problem. That was some wonderful questions, Ted. So thank you ever so much.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.